And yeah, welcome everyone to today's IPC&M CPD Building Masterclass. So as I mentioned in the chat, my name is Julie Kennedy and I am based in the Netherlands. So today I am delighted to welcome back expert speaker, author, and of course, top coach, Paul Boehnke. A man of many talents, which I have been fortunate to interview here before. And of many talents, they also include maybe less well-known. He's actually a classical musician and quite a cook, if I remember well. So luckiest to have you here today. Welcome back. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into our topic for those joining us for the first time. Our call today will be a maximum of 1 hour, and that includes 15 minutes Q&A. Feel free, if you have a burning issue, to raise your hand, or otherwise you can also just jot the question down in the comments and we can take it as we go along. It would be great if you could keep your videos on, just so that Paul sees who he is talking to, but keep it muted unless you have a burning question or unless Paul asks you to unmute. So I do hope you have your CPD pad and your pen ready, because this is really a hot topic, I find, because I believe we all have one. Some of ours are louder than others, but we're going to be talking about from adversary to ally, how to work with the inner critic, right? That little... So thank you. That's all from my side for now. Paul, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Yes, happy to be here. And Anne, happy to see that you're from Central Virginia as well.
Sorry,
there.
my fault. I was supposed to be muting myself, not you.
Yeah, I was just in Washington, D.C. area for a coaching conference there. Anyway, happy to be here. So the inner critic, this little voice in our head that is so often telling us that we're, well, not qualified enough, not skilled enough, just not good enough in one way or another. And in my experience and that of my clients, it kind of feels like it's the enemy, that this inner critic seems to be what's always holding us back. It's between where we are and what we want. I'm just curious with a hand raise here, who recognizes that you've got a voice like this in your head? Anybody? Okay, a couple of hands. Now, I will say I noticed that there weren't absolutely every hand. And so if at the moment you happen to be thinking that, well, no, I don't really have a voice in my head like this, that's actually the voice that I'm talking about right there. None of us are going to get off scot-free with this conversation here today. But what we're going to be talking about is sort of ways that this voice little shows up, how it causes us to behave, and most importantly, the way I help my clients turn this negative self-talk into encouragement and into inspiration as well. Now, for me, this whole work with the inner critic unconsciously began basically when I was 26. See, I was playing a piece of music that I hadn't played in 5 years, when suddenly my mind was filled with, well, thoughts of a woman that I'd had a crush on 5 years earlier. I could feel my heartbeat speeding up and that sort of swirl of emotion sort of throwing me off balance. And it was all quite sudden and frankly, pretty unsettling, because why was I thinking thoughts 5 years ago, thoughts really that had nothing to do with my life today? Well, after that initial shock wore off, I realized that those 5-year-old thoughts returned to my mind at a very specific place in the piece of music that I was playing. You see, back in college, when I was in music school, I was learning this piece of music. It was hard. And there's this one little 4-measure section that was particularly difficult, and it just was not getting any better over the days and the weeks that I'd been working on it. So I decided what I would do is devote 40 minutes of one practice time to just those 4 bars, playing them over and over, hoping that they would become less awkward. Well, all that repetition worked. They did become less awkward. But the interesting thing is that during those 40 minutes, I was thinking about this woman. And 5 years later, when those thoughts came screaming back to my head, it had hit me. I had practiced those thoughts along with those notes, that they'd become so attached to each other that all I had to do was play those notes and those thoughts returned. Well, since apparently I was practicing thoughts when I practiced music, I thought, wouldn't it be a good idea if maybe I was a little more careful what I was thinking about? That the thoughts I thought while I was practicing were thoughts that helped my music making. So after about 30 years as a classical musician, that's one of the things that I got pretty good at, training my mind to think what I needed it to think and to do it on cue. Now, the inner critic, of course, it shows up on cue as well. You know, whenever we're, well, doing something new or unfamiliar, it's there right next to us, usually telling us not to do whatever it is. Now, I was recently in a webinar with a US-based MCC coach, Marcia Reynolds, who's been around this industry for a very long time. And she said, you know, our job as coaches is really to help our clients think about their thinking. Brilliant, I thought. That's exactly what we do. But then I had the question, but what are thoughts? So I went digging. And what I discovered was that thoughts were really just electrochemical signals that our brain cells use to communicate with each other. And when they do that, they form connections or pathways, networks, that actually make it easier to think that thought again, which of course makes that network stronger, which makes it easier to think again. You can sort of see how this cycle happens. And this is really what habits are made of. Now, we're going to talk a little more about the significance of this a bit later. But even though our inner critic is also just thoughts, these thoughts have a pretty large effect in our lives. Now, here's just a small list of some of the ways that the inner critic can show up in our lives. And I say small because I had to make the type pretty small to get this to fit. I want you to know that I didn't cheat. There's no duplications, and this list is not exhaustive. However, when I look at this list, I sometimes feel exhausted. So let's pare it down a little bit to something that's a little more manageable. I would love to hear from you in the chat or just live, come off mute. What from this list do you recognize happening in your clients or people that you work with? What are the ones that you see happening?
Oh, Paul, so many of them. There's a lot of the self-criticism, the self-neglect, frustration, helplessness, hopelessness, a lot of that. Very familiar.
Yes. And when you recognize that in your clients or people that you're working with, what effect does it have in their lives?
Detrimental.
Detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
It probably stops them from doing things. Is that's kind of what's happening? They find themselves kind of stuck behind some sort of brick wall.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. Rosemary says, I see procrastination and perfectionism a lot, criticizing others. Yes, anxiety, procrastination, many more. Lynn says, I see it in myself too, if you're honest. Yes, thank you, because that was my next slightly more difficult question is, what here do you recognize in your own life? Call that worry, anxiety, resistance, distracted. Yeah. Trouble saying no. That's a good one. Absolutely. And what are the costs that you experience for these things in your life? What are the costs that you experience in your career or your business? Does it keep you from stepping out in ways that will help you build your business or take you further? Rosemary says exhaustion. Yeah. What are the costs in a relationship? You have trouble being as open, as honest. Hold us back. Income for sure. Yes. Creates problems with income. Thank you for sharing that, Lynn. Absolutely. Now, there are a couple of particularly common ways that this shows up, and almost all of us experience them at some time or other and to some degree. And these are, whoops, let's see here. Need to get back to the ones that show up really commonly are the procrastinator and the worrier. And what I would like to do is spend just a few minutes sort of looking a little more deeply into each of these and see if we can sort of figure out what the story is going on underneath. So the procrastinator. Now, Dan was working on a project for work when he sat down at his computer and there was something that caught his eye that, well, reminded him of his experience on the debate team when he was back in school. He clicked on it. He was just saying to himself, oh, I'm just going to look at this for a second. It's just kind of interesting. But of course, that ended up leading to another website about the history of debates, which led to a YouTube video that's a compilation of all the funniest lines of past US presidential debates. And in one of those in 1984, this led to another video where Walter Mondale, who was a presidential candidate at the time, asks, where is the beef? Which leads to another video about how to make a really great burger, and then ends with an interview with Justin Bieber, who apparently likes a good burger. This is how it goes for so many of us. We get distracted by something that seems pretty interesting in the moment. The problem, of course, is that it takes you away from, well, what you're really trying to get done. And for Dan, this often will have a tendency to go on for a while. And that's what was happening for him. All of a sudden, it was the night before the deadline for this project, when suddenly all the adrenaline kicks in, the excitement takes over, he shifts into high gear, he works all night, forgets to eat dinner, scrambles to put everything together and make it look like he spent a month working on it. And then he does this slow motion dive over the finish line at just the very last moment. Anyone ever witnessed anything like this? Is this something, yeah? Or, well, let's be honest, anybody ever do anything like this as well? Yeah, absolutely. Now, a little bit later, we're going to talk about what the story was that Dan was telling himself that was at the root of his procrastination, what was really going on for him. But this is not the only kind of procrastination that happens. There's the procrastinator who procrastinates because they don't have a looming deadline. And tragically, this kind of procrastination can go on for years. Now, there's a client that I will call Lisa, was experiencing just this type of procrastination. Now, Lisa had grown up in a family that, well, frankly, wasn't terribly stable. Her mother's alcoholism tended to fuel a lot of the drama that had her parents frequently arguing and had Lisa feeling kind of scared and vulnerable as a child. Now, as children do, she learned coping skills and figured out how to sort of survive her situation. Well, eventually, she grew up, she found herself married, raising a couple of kids, managing a household, even sometimes caring for her husband's aging parents. And Lisa worked hard to provide the sort of stability and the certainty for her family that she wanted as a child. Keeping herself and her family safe, understandably, became a driving force in her life. The problem, of course, was that this need for safety and stability, it caused her to become increasingly isolated, which of course made the world seem even more dangerous than it actually was, which leads to even more isolation. There's a vicious little cycle that really kept her from living her life fully. Now, by the time Lisa contacted me, she had felt sort of caught in this never-ending cycle that had her procrastinating, well, on her life. She wanted to escape this pattern, but she just couldn't figure out how to do it. We'll take a look at some of the stories she was telling herself a little later as well. But first, let's take a look at some data about procrastination. Now, they say that 80 to 95% of college students procrastinate to some degree. Anybody here have a college student in your life? Yes. Does this statistic surprise you? It didn't surprise me in the least. However, before we get too smug about seeing all that procrastination in college students, here's another piece of information. That 88% of all of us procrastinate at least an hour every day, and we do it on the job. 20 to 25% of us procrastinate chronically. These are the ones who make it a lifestyle. These are the ones who show up late to everything. These are the ones that you tell something starts a half an hour earlier before it actually does, so you hope that they show up on time, 75% of us consider procrastination a problem. And here in the US, it is estimated that procrastination costs the economy $70 billion a year. Now, studies have also linked procrastination to things like depression, anxiety, stress, poor sleep, physical activity, physical inactivity, loneliness, and those who are experiencing it, there's often feelings of guilt, shame, or disappointment. So that's a little look at the procrastinator. Let's take a look at another really common one, this time, the worrier. There are 4 little words that can stop anyone in their tracks. 4 little words that can shoot down any idea, any impulse, any idea. And these 4 little words, yeah, but what if? These can turn anyone into a worrier. You see, these 4 little words, they tend to raise the specter of things going wrong, of disaster lurking just around the corner, unseen. They make us worry about, well, losing a job or a relationship or money, time, well, frankly, almost anything. Young Hua had been working in organizational development in a large corporation for 6 years. Now, what this means in her case is that she often spends a lot of time sitting in her cubicle, looking at spreadsheets, trying to figure out why the business isn't growing as quickly as they'd projected and what they can do to turn that around. Now, Hyung Hwa was pretty good at finding the problem and coming up with solutions. And she'd turned quite a few challenging downturns into opportunities for growth. And she liked this sort of problem-solving part of her job. But she also felt kind of distant and disconnected from the people whose lives would be affected by her work. And the job was feeling kind of unfulfilling and like it was just sort of sucking her soul out. Well, one day, she saw an ad for a local business. And she realized that, small businesses, they were really in need of exactly the same kind of help that she provided the corporation every day. Well, not only were they in need, but the impact she could have was so much more tangible, more immediate. She'd be able to see it in the faces of those that she helped. And then the thought occurred to her that she could start a small business helping entrepreneurs build their own businesses. And immediately she felt excited by this idea and knew that this was what she was really called to do. There was a sense of energy and fulfillment about the idea of working directly with business owners rather than with this sort of faceless corporation. So later that evening, she started writing up a business plan and began seeing her vision take shape right before her eyes. And as this happened, she became more and more convinced that this was the path for her. Now, she also gradually began to realize that, well, starting her own business was a bit more complicated than the original idea led on. You see, in her research, she started looking at websites of others doing similar things and noticed that they had some really pretty great websites. But of course, her next thought was, well, what if my site's not as good? She'd never designed a website before. What if it was too hard for her? What if potential clients didn't take her seriously because of her website? A little dent in her dream began to appear. Well, a few days later, and Younghwa was still excited by this idea, but she comes face to face with the fact that, well, starting a business, that can easily be a full-time job. And unfortunately, she already had one of those. She worried about how she might balance her corporate job and build her business at the same time. And then she thought, what if she invested money in her business, but then wasn't able to make the time to follow through and ended up losing both the money and her own business? What if this turned out to be just kind of a lose-lose situation? Things were beginning to feel a little more complicated. Then another thought entered her mind. What if her boss saw her new business as a conflict of interest? What if they ended up making her choose between the two before her business was really established? What if her business didn't generate the income she needs by the time she needs it? What if, in addition to losing her steady, predictable income, she exhausts her savings? What if she defaults on her mortgages, loses her house, finds herself living under a bridge, eating ramen every day? This can sound a bit ridiculous to us, of course, right now. But how often have you gone down a spiral of doom like that? I know I have. Now, Younghwa, she found herself paralyzed by worry, stuck between her current stability with its lack of fulfillment on one hand, and then the promise that her dream held for exciting and meaningful work on the other hand. And all she could hear was, yeah, but what if? You see, these 4 words are really just the rational brain justifying the worries of the fear center of the brain, the amygdala. Now, let's say you have an emotional response that arises from the amygdala, and then you begin to tell stories that sort of spread the worry to other parts of your brain, which then just confirms the original worries. And then, of course, your prefrontal cortex steps in with rationalizations and justifications that align and support the conclusion your amygdala has already come to. And pretty soon, all you hear are the negative, worrisome things that could possibly go wrong. Now, this is the negativity bias at work. You see, our brain, it naturally pays more attention to things considered negative than it does to what it considers positive. We make an unconscious assumption that bad things are more likely to happen than good. But why do we believe outcomes are likely to be negative? Isn't there actually an equal chance that the outcomes could be positive? Well, as it turns out, no, there isn't an equal chance of outcomes being better than expected. There is a nearly 100% chance that outcomes will be better than we fear. You see, studies have shown that 91% of what we worry about never happens. And of the small sliver that do come true, nearly all turn out better than we expected. You see, fear and worry are really strange things. They keep us focused on what appear to be negative consequences while ignoring the fact that they almost never come true. And then they also blind us to all the possible positive outcomes. So those are the 2, yes, they all turn out more positive than we expected. These are the 2 most common manifestations of the inner critic. What is it that you identify with the most, or both? Or what do you see going on? This is where so much of our energy is taken up. Now, I've worked with a lot of different clients on these sorts of issues, and I want to share with you just a couple of stories of how we've been able to create some real change in their lives. Now, there was a musician client of mine who was dealing with a combination of perfectionism and imposter syndrome, a nasty sort of double whammy. And his perfectionism told him first that he needed to play perfectly, no wrong notes, no flawless rhythm. All the sort of thousands of details it takes to play music had to be perfect. Meanwhile, every time a wrong note would pop up, the same voice sort of berated him as stupid and told him that he wasn't up to this. He wasn't smart enough. He wasn't talented enough. And of course, then the imposter syndrome would step in and say, see, I told you you are not qualified for this. You're really a fraud just pretending to be a professional. Well, after working together and sort of getting underneath this, he discovered actually that he was talented enough, he was smart enough, professional enough, and that the biggest problem he faced was actually the voice in his head that said he wasn't those things. He's now feeling more grounded and emotionally stable than he's ever felt. His performances are stronger and freer because he's got this voice in his head encouraging him rather than lying in wait to sort of point out any imperfection. Now, I'll quickly share one more story of a client. This one happened to have been a brand new coach, and his perfectionism and worry was running him ragged as he was trying to get his business up and running. You see, he was setting up his website, figuring out what his coaching packages would look like, what the pricing should be. He was networking. He was doing all these things that business owners do. But no matter how much he got accomplished, the little voice in his head told him it wasn't enough. And then the bar of expectation would be raised every time he achieved something. His inner critic accused him of not being capable of running his own business, and then used these changing expectations as proof. To be honest, when he came to me, he was feeling exhausted and ready to give up on his dream. Well, after we dug into this together, he discovered the truth that, of course, building a business isn't a journey of perfection. But not only that, but what felt like failures to him, they often turned out to be what inspired new growth, new opportunities. And he created a new belief for himself that really released the burden that he'd placed on himself. And he was surprised to find sort of the sense of peace and ease in his life and his work. And I actually ran into him about 3 weeks ago. And he was sharing with me that, yes, he is still experiencing this peace and ease, but what it was really surprised is how he is now eagerly accomplishing all sorts of tasks in his business that beforehand would have seemed burdensome. You see, this is what happens when you can turn this voice in your head from an adversary into an ally. This is powerful stuff. Now, most of us, when we're doing our best to deal with the inner critic, the process we tend to use is something similar to sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall and just hoping that something sticks. We try anything. What we really need, however, is a method or a process, something that can take us from where we are to where we want to be quickly, efficiently, powerfully, and without all those useless detours spaghetti tends to bring to us. Now, I took what I learned about training my brain as a musician, and I combined that with what I learned in my coach training, and I've developed a method that I'm calling Thoughts on Demand. And I've written about this process in detail in my book. Now, I would like to spend the rest of our time together today talking through this process and showing you a framework that can change critical inner voice into one that supports and encourages. But before we dive in, I want to share a free resource with you. And this is for those of you who love taking notes. Well, actually, maybe it's for those of you who hate to take notes because, you see, I have done that for you. And Julie, if this is a time you could put that first link in the chat, this would be great. You can get a copy of these notes for free. You can just click the link that Julie just put in there, enter your email, and you'll immediately be able to download a copy of these notes. Now, you'll also get an email with a link where you can download them again later. And at the end of our time together, I have another free resource for you as well if you're wanting some more information. But I want you to know I put more into these notes than I'm going to be able to cover today to try to make them as valuable for you as possible. Plus, the other reason I like to do this is because then you're free to really be present during our time together here and not worried about making sure that you get all the details down, because I've taken care of that for you. So there's that link is in the chat there. So let's take a look. What does this framework, the Thoughts on Demand framework, look like? Well, it kind of looks like this. You'll see it's not exactly a straight line, but there are sort of 4 phases to this. The first one is to simply recognize that all this negative self-talk, all that's going on with your inner critic are really just thoughts that have become a habit. The second phase is to uncover the lies that these messages tell us. The third is to create a new message, a new belief that you want. And the fourth, well, is to practice this new message so that it becomes your new habit. Now, if you recall, let's take a look at each of these sort of in detail. If you recall, we talked earlier about what thoughts are, and they're just being electrochemical signals in our brain that the brain cells use to communicate with each other, and that they do this often to form these networks and create habits. This is exactly what's happening with the inner critic. We have these thoughts and we think the same one sort of over and over, and that's how they become a habit for us. Now, you might think, well, this is kind of stupid. It's obvious that these are just thoughts. But I can tell you my experience with clients is that so often there is a huge sense of relief when they realize these thoughts are not who they are. They have a tendency to identify themselves with us. And when we can create this separation, say there's you and there's these thoughts, there's a huge sense of relief. And so this creates a little space. That's why this is an important first phase. Now, The next two phases, they're a bit more complicated and definitely not a straight line. The second one is to uncover the lies that this inner critic has been telling you. Now, I have yet to encounter an inner critic message that isn't ultimately based on a lie. Oh, these lies, they tend to come with plenty of evidence. And there's usually lots of justification, lots of rationalization about why what this voice is telling you is true. In fact, negative self-talk is usually pretty loud, pretty in your face, pretty hard to ignore, and this ends up being its biggest clue. Because when someone tries to convince you of something, what do? Well, they tell you all the reasons that you should believe them. They dredge up all sorts of evidence to prove what they're telling you is true. They justify why you should believe what they want you to believe. They will rationalize away any weakness in their argument. They will talk and talk and talk until you're blue in the face, until you give in. This is just like our inner critic. They can be relentless. But why do they work so hard? Well, I think they work so hard because what they want, what they're trying to convince you of, probably isn't true. Because, well, how does truth convince us? It doesn't. It's simply there for us to recognize. Truth doesn't try to convince anyone of anything. It just is. And you're welcome to believe it or not. And recognizing what the truth is, this is usually a pretty quiet affair. Truth speaks with that still, small voice within. It asks us to be open and receptive. And when we're filled with noise and activity and distraction, it can be pretty difficult to hear what truth has to tell us. So this second phase is simply to push aside everything that's not true, so that what is true begins to shine through. And when this happens, this is when you get to the core of the stories your inner critic uses to hold you back. Do you remember our procrastinating friend Dan? Well, through our conversations, we discovered that he loved the feeling the deadline was looming and his adrenaline kicked into high gear. You see, he felt more present, more engaged, more focused, more productive than any other time in his life. No wonder he procrastinated. Who wouldn't, if you believe that this sort of procrastination is what helps you feel alive? But there was the lie for him, that he needed adrenaline-fueled pressure to feel alive. Or how about Hyunghwa? She was the worrier, the one who was always saying, yeah, but what if? You see, the story she was telling herself was that if she could predict possible problems, she could avoid them. In other words, worry kept her safe. This is why it was so hard for her to move past that worry. But of course, well, worry had her worried, not feeling safe. And uncovering this lie helped to free her from that grip. Now, those are just a couple examples of how getting to the lies under the lies that the inner critic tells us, how this frees us up to a completely new approach. Now, the third phase of this process is to create a new message. Now, this is basically creating an affirmation. Some of you may love affirmations. Some of you may have tried them, well, found them to be ineffective, useless, kind of a big waste of time. If you happen to be in that second camp, I am willing to wager that regardless of how powerful any affirmation was that you were using, it wasn't the right one for you. You see, we've all got custom-created self-doubts. And if we're to overcome them, we need a custom-designed solution that speaks to the lies that we just uncovered in that last phase, that speak to them in a way that strips them of their power, and that speak to us in ways that are supportive and encouraging. And that's what this third phase is about, creating that custom-designed message that suits you and your situation. Now, usually, when I ask clients what they want their new message to be, they usually come up with something like, the opposite of the old story. For instance, if the old one was, you're not smart enough, they'll say, I am smart enough. Makes sense. It's the first logical place to go. And well, it's better than the original one. However, this ends up being one of the biggest obstacles that keeps us from making progress against our inner critic, because you see, the opposite story doesn't work. All it does is it just creates an argument that keeps the old message alive and well. What we need to do is to get to the bottom of your personal story and then find those custom created solutions that will really speak, that get around the message that you uncovered, that doesn't argue with them, but that creates something that simply addresses the same issue. Remember Lisa, the one who was procrastinating on her life because she believed the world was too unpredictable and unsafe for her to navigate. Well, after uncovering that core lie that the world was too unsafe, the new message she came up with was, I'm a warrior. This new message, it helped her feel capable of moving through the world and to sort of stop procrastinating on her life. And she realized that as an adult, she was capable of handling what life threw at her. And saying, I'm a warrior, it reminded her of that fact. Now, I had another client who was a physicist who was also neurodiverse, and his core lie was that he was different, he was broken, and he was not fixable. It took us a little while to sort of get under there, but all these messages he was telling himself sort of boiled down to that. Well, the new message this physicist created for himself was, I am part of this universe and I belong here. You see, this spoke to the lie in a way that didn't create an argument. We didn't talk about being broken or not fixable or different. And this message for him was a huge relief. Now, as you can see, these middle two phases are not the straight line. They're a bit complicated. We tend to go back and forth around them. We tend to spend a lot of time in these two, and they are not about getting some sort of generic solution that works for everyone. They really uncover your unique custom designed self-doubts and then create that custom designed message or solution. This is really the key to this process. Actually, it's the first key. There's a second one we'll talk about in a little bit, but these are really important keys here. This is the meat and potatoes. We go back and forth between these two phases multiple times because we uncover a lie which tends to inspire a new message. And once we start working with that, we sometimes discover, oh, there's another layer of lies. So we peel back yet one more. Now, I need to say that I am not a therapist, and this process should not be confused with therapy. Are there some similarities? Well, the second phase often deals with past experiences, like therapy tends to. We're not, however, trying to heal old wounds or do therapy around it. We're just trying to gain a little clarity about what's really at the root of your critical inner voice. Now, having said that, the effect of this work can often feel therapeutic to people. I had one client who, after she uncovered the core lie she had believed, she told me that, for the first time in her life, she felt whole. So this can have pretty big effects on us. Now, as you can probably guess, there's a little more to these two phases than we really have time to get into today, but I do want to talk in more depth about this last phase of the process, practice. This is what I did during those 40 minutes back in college. I repeated the same thoughts over and over. They became as ingrained and as automatic as the notes that I was learning to play. Now, you may be asking, well, how do we know that practicing affirmation really works? Well, we know because this is exactly what your inner critic has been doing for years, repeating certain thoughts over and over and over. Now, those thoughts may be more condemnation than affirmation, but the process is the same. What you think repeatedly becomes your belief. It becomes the way you show up in life. Now, this phase, this is also where the rubber meets the road. And fair warning, this is also where most people turn back. Because you see, they believe that knowing something is enough. That I've got those other 3 phases down perfectly. Great. But if you don't practice this new message, nothing will change. This is the second key to this process, the action, making it a new thing. Now, you might be asking, well, what does practicing look like? What do you mean practicing? Well, just like in practicing music or a golf swing or lines in a play or whatever it is that you are doing, you need to repeat it many times. In this case, this new message. Now, my wife was also a musician, and she and I were talking about this, about practicing and repetition, and how students often didn't quite get what we were talking about. She told me a story about a student who came and said, there's this one little part in this piece that I just can't get. It's just not getting any better. My wife said, well, you need to really just isolate that and then repeat that over many times. Student said, okay, great. Went home, did that, came back the next week and said, I did what you said. I isolated it, I practiced it, but it didn't really change. My wife said, well, how many times do you think that you practiced it? Oh, well, shoot, I was probably getting pretty close to 10 times. My wife smiled and said, that's great. But, I was thinking more like 100 or 500 or 1,000. It's this consistent practice of many repetitions. The other thing about practicing is just like I did as a professional musician, you show up to practice, frankly, whether you feel inspired to at the moment or not. You make it a consistent practice. You put it on your schedule and you go to work. In this case, practicing your new message. Now, having said that, I also want you to know that you should start your practicing when you think you don't need to. You see, as a musician, I didn't start practicing when I walked out on stage in front of an audience. No, I started long before the pressure of that situation was there. You need to do the same thing when you're creating a new habit or belief. You need to start when you're feeling good, when you're not challenged by the old ones. A couple other things that make practicing really effective. We want to involve your emotions and your body. Now, you see, in crafting this new message, we want to get one that not only addresses the lies, but feels great to you. We want at least a sense of relief. Preferably, we want to get to inspiration. Because when you get yourself emotionally involved in this, then that creates a habit much quicker, much deeper, much more sustainably. Your body, we want that involved as well. We want to get your head, your heart, and your body involved. If as a musician, during those 40 minutes in college, I was playing notes, so I had my body involved in that. And it doesn't much matter what it is your body does, but if you can pair all 3 of those things together, then you've got a chance of creating a really strong habit pretty quickly. Now, some people enter the emotion easier than the thought. They say, oh, I know how I want to feel. Great. Take that as your doorway in. And then just find a message to support that emotion that you know you want to feel. I was working with a physical therapist a while back, and she said, oh, I know exactly what my body needs to do to express what I want. Terrific. Show me. So we talked about that. We got that nailed in. I said, how does that feel when you do that? And she described the emotional impact and how it was so positive and empowering. And I said, great. What words can we add to this to simply tie this all together and to remind you? It doesn't matter where you start, whether you start with a new verbal message, an emotion, or a physical activity. Enter wherever it's easiest for you. But when you combine them all, that's when you have a powerful new habit. So that's really the Thoughts on Demand framework. And as I mentioned, those 2 middle phases, they're highly personalized. Uncovering the lies on your own, well, this can be a little bit tricky. I mean, I'm curious here, who here has tried to coach themselves? Ever done that? Any self-coaches here? Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't we do that? And my guess is you've had some decent success with that. But I also know that we tend not to ask ourselves the really important questions, the ones that really need to get asked. We tend to take the safe way out. And when we work with our coaches on this, or with someone on the outside, they're the ones who can really help us get to the bottom of the message, who can really help us discern what's going on with this new message I'm creating. Is there still a sense of resistance about it, or what's going on? It's much easier for other people to help us see that. This process is fairly simple in its concept, but the depth of the personalization is what makes this amazingly effective. Now, I may have stirred up some things in you today. I mean, we all identify with one or more of these manifestations of the inner critic to some extent. We saw a list of them that you put in the chat earlier today. And I want to share just a couple of resources with you that can help you go deeper. Of course, first is my book, Thoughts on Demand. It outlines in detail, much greater detail, what I've talked about today. If you're interested in that, you can go to thoughtsondemand.org and learn about that there. But I'd also like you to think back to the costs that you identified that you experience because of your critical inner thoughts. The costs of finances, the costs of holding you back in your career, whatever the costs might be in a relationship. I hope that you realize that this method that I've just shared with you, it really does get to the root of what's going on so that you can move past those costs. And I also told you about the impact of working with this process has had on a couple of different clients, how in one case it changed the way a musician performs, in another case, how it really unleashed all sorts of energy for business building in another. Now, other clients have remarked how this work not only provides the tools to move past whatever was blocking them, but how the work also builds on itself in ways that keep the growth going long after we had stopped working together. Now, there's a quote that I love that's been attributed to Goethe. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it, because boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. And as true and as powerful as these words are, I'm sorry to report, Goethe never said that. However, what Goethe did say in a rough translation was, enough words have been exchanged. Now at last, let me see some action. I have shared with you lots of words today. And now I want to challenge you to take some bold action, to discover the genius, the power, and the magic that that action can elicit. If you find yourself intrigued by this framework that I've told you about, if you're wanting to really go deeper with this work, to learn how you can incorporate it more in your life, or how you can learn more about it to work with your clients, I would love to have a conversation with you. And Julie, if you would put the second link in the chat, if you click on the link or go to this QR code, answer a couple of questions, and we can immediately schedule a free, no obligation conversation. We can talk a little bit about what's going on with the inner critic, and we can sort of look at what are some strategies or some resources that might be helpful to you. I really encourage you to turn your words into bold action. Just schedule a time where we can talk if this is something that you're feeling drawn towards. Now, I'd also like to leave you with a little discovery I've had regarding the inner critic. You see, when we started this, as I mentioned, we tend to think of this inner critic as our enemy. But it turns out it's not. In reality, this inner critic ends up being our partner, because you see, it is what calls us into a new relationship with ourselves and the world around us. And without the pain that the inner critic causes, we'd never go looking for something else. Your inner critic ends up being the biggest gift you've been given. And using this thoughts on demand method really does turn what feels like an adversary into an ally. Embrace that partner. Unlock the secrets that it has to tell you, and take some bold action today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I would love to continue this conversation, answer any questions, learn from you about what is going on with inner critics and your work as coaches.
Wow. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. You're an amazing storyteller. I think we were all, of course, we were all muted, but I could still see that everybody was silent and listening to all of that. And it just, yeah, you worded it in a way which makes total sense. And it just looks like such a clear way forward that I don't believe we can do it ourselves, even if we're magnificent coaches. I think we do need that outside to really ask us those questions, because the critic is interfering in that as well, isn't he, or she?
Absolutely. He comes full force with disguises, but full force.
Right, exactly. And I mean, it really is the question is, who would we be if we didn't have that inner critic? I mean, I think, well, certainly my side with age, I realize that it does hold me back from so many things. And it's a shame, right? That's we're here to really be our full potential. Right now, does anybody have a question? We're lucky to have Paul here live, and we still have, 10 minutes. Does anybody have anything specific that they want to ask? There's no wrong question. It's just entirely out there. Just feel free to unmute or put it, or raise your hand or write it. Oh yeah, here, sorry. Anne says, can you give more examples of the physical actions that people take to accompany the affirmations and emotions? Thank you, Anne.
Yes, thank you for that question. They can be anything. As you noticed, my own example from when I was a musician, it was playing notes on a keyboard instrument. Like, that had nothing to do with the thoughts, had nothing to do with the emotions, but they became paired. Now, when I'm working with clients, I usually say, it's maybe a good idea to find something that is somehow is supportive or expresses the idea that you're trying to make a habit, that feels like a stronger connection, whether it's a power pose or a fist punch in the air or a blink of an eye. Or you can press your big toe down in your shoe against the floor. Anything works if it involves your body. And just the power of these three things together. I said how that habit that I'd created in 40 minutes lasted 5 years. I'm going to be honest with you. It lasted over 30 years with only 40 minutes of practice. Now, normally it's going to take longer than 40 minutes. It's not like flipping a switch. But what made this one so powerful was the physical activity was the same over. There's only 4 measures of music. So it's the same thing a lot, over and over and over. I was having the same similar thoughts. But frankly, these thoughts were not actually about love. They were about my lovability, which really sort of got to the core of me emotionally. Yeah. So the really emotionally empowered experiences, that's what really helps put this together. The physical activity, it can literally be anything. Whatever suits you, whatever feels like it works for you. Now, some people will say, well, how long should this take to create a new habit? I did that one that lasted a long time in 40 minutes. That's pretty unusual. I've heard statistics that say, if you do the same thing for 59 days in a row, you created a new habit. I've heard exactly the same thing that says, no, it takes 63 days. I have a violinist friend of mine who lives in Vancouver who said, I have discovered that if I practice something for 3 months and 12 days, suddenly a switch flips and it's a different thing. The point is, there isn't a time that is right or wrong for you. It takes as long as it takes. And that question, how long should it take? I think this is an example of how wily and shape-shifting the inner critic is. Because I think that question comes from the inner critic. Because it is trying to measure to see whether you measure up. If it didn't happen in 59 days or 63 days, it'll say, oh, yep, see, you're doing something wrong. This isn't going to work. You may as well just give up. I'm too strong. Okay. Or if something miraculous happens and 2 days later, he said, wow, this is amazing. The inner critic will say, well, no. This takes at least 59 days or however long it is. You must be doing something wrong. You're missing something. This isn't going to work. It is the wrong question. It doesn't matter. I think of a road trip. Now, this could be from, let's say, from Amsterdam to Milan. That's a long way. Or if you're here in the States, maybe let's say Detroit to San Francisco. It's a long way. You're driving along and you're going and you're going, you're driving. You begin to feel kind of tired of driving and you say, man, this is taking forever. And let's say you get 3/4 of the way there. Let's say you make it to, I don't know, maybe Paris or Basel or something like that, or maybe Reno, Nevada here in the States. And you say, oh, this is just taking too long. I give up. I'm going to turn around and go back home. You don't do that because you know if you keep going, you're going to get there. This is the same thing. You just keep practicing. Have faith. Know that persistence will win out. You will get there. You just have to keep driving. Yeah.
Yeah. We've seen the comments there, Paul.
Yes, how you describe piano playing has been a light bulb. Great. Yeah, absolutely. We're always work to do. I believe that recognize the negative thoughts is the hardest part. We have to accept that we currently do is not serving us.
What we're currently doing is not serving us, yeah.
Yes. Or another way to look at that is to say, how is what I'm currently doing actually serving me? There's got to be some payoff for it, or you wouldn't continue doing it. For Dan, the procrastinator, the payoff was he got to feel really alive. It wasn't serving him well in his career in lots of other ways, but boy, in the moment, it felt great. So there is some way that these beliefs are serving you. Finding out what that is, that's the trick.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, because we don't do detrimental behavior on purpose. There is somewhere there a reason why we're doing it. It's to protect ourselves from failure or from whatever. So there is, but we need to unmask it. And I think that is the part where probably we need the coach the most because we can't see it. Otherwise, we would have stopped already, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Any other questions? Concrete things, any steps? I mean, I'm thankful for the links you've given us. Dawn, do you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Paul said there about what did I write down? How is this belief serving you? Yeah, that is and can be a great way to get you thinking about things. However, I'm thinking about a particular client of mine that will use that question to continue those bad habits because she's validating what she's currently doing. So actually that can be a negative side as well.
Yes. And the question that comes to my mind, I mean, I obviously don't know the particular situation that you're dealing with here, but the question that comes to my mind is that, oh, does she get to be right? Is that the payoff? If I believe this, I get to be right.
Correct.
I told
that
you.
Is
like,
absolutely spot on. Do you know her?
No, I don't. Well, I probably know a lot of people.
Hundreds of them.
I probably am her. I don't know. You know.
Yeah, we all do it, but it just made me laugh because that is exactly what's going on.
Yes, yes. There's something that we get out of it. And just being clear about that allows us then to make a choice. Oh, I do get this out of it. If procrastinating makes me feel really alive, do I want to continue doing that? And we get to make a choice, a conscious choice, yes or no. Either way, a conscious choice is a powerful thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's lots of thanks here as well, Paul.
Yes, thank you, Lynn.
mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you from me for sharing all of this. I would certainly recommend taking a look at the book. Thank you for the links. Well done. Congratulations. I sort of celebrate all of you for having turned up today after maybe a busy day. So you've made time to grow and expand the horizon for what's possible for you and for the people that you're lucky enough to be coaching. Don't forget to write in your CPD pads, make the most of this so that we can also take some concrete action points after all of this information. I'm just checking the last 2 messages. It's all thank you, thank you, thank you. So from my side and IAPC&M, thank you to all of you and looking forward to our next one. And we have Paul again in November, if I'm not mistaken. So watch this space, right? All the very best to you. Have a lovely evening wherever you are and a lovely day to you, Paul. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.